Okay, so while I introduce myself, you could, put up the slides that we're going to share. My name is Allen Easley. I was elected Synod Treasurer at the May 2023 Assembly, so I've been nearly one full year on the job, learning as I go. I want to give a special thanks to Tom Pankow, the prior treasurer, and Terry Robertson, the executive assistant for administration and finance, for their help to get me up to speed. It's a complicated operation, and I needed all the help I could get. I do want to give everybody a reminder. I think a lot of you are also wanting to join the hearing on the constitutional amendments at 11:15 Pacific. And that is on a different Zoom link. So you have to, when this meeting ends, you have to disconnect from the Zoom link and then start a new one. I'm going to go through pretty quickly the finance materials in the Assembly notebook to try to leave as much time as I can for questions and answers. If you have questions, please use the raised hand function. If you look at the bottom of the screen, there's a reactions button, and one of the options is a raised hand, or you can type your questions in the chat. And Terry is going to monitor both the raised hands and the chat. And she's also going to listen closely to what I'm saying and step in if I say anything wrong. So we'll start with slide 3-1. And this slide shows the historical trends in financial gifts to the Synod over a 7-year period from 2017-18 to 23-24. The totals are in blue. Red is mission support, which is the Synod tithes received from congregations. Green is designated gifts, also mostly from congregations, but designated for specific purposes, often worthy ELCA or Synod causes. And then purple is pulled out because there's always been a steady flow of designated gifts from congregations to ELCA World Hunger. Mission support is the largest item. It represents nearly half of the Synod's budget, as we'll see shortly. I think this is also important to call out because I think it's a measure of the strengths or struggles of our congregations within the Synod. You can see when you look at this history that there were occasional upticks over the last 7 years, but it's been kind of a steady, slow downward trend as congregations shrink or in some cases close. Last year, mission support was 1.277 million. One thing that's quite noticeable in this graph is the uptick on the green line last year, designated giving from congregations. And this is largely, though not entirely, due to gifts designated for Hawaii wildfire relief, which were received from individuals and congregations and synods across the country. The next slide, Terry. You can see here in a pie chart format the same information on financial gifts to the Synod focused on the 23-24 year that you saw in the previous slide with one addition. So in blue, on the right side, you see mission support from congregations. That's the 1.277 million, which represents 48% of our revenue. Then designated gifts from our congregations broken out into 4 categories. Designated gifts to the ELCA ministries, orange, Hawaii wildfire relief, purple, Pacifica Ministries green, and other designated ministries red. And if you add those all up together, it totals roughly $795,000. The other income in this pie chart that was not on the previous slide is non-congregational income in the upper left corner, which I guess I would call that reddish brown. This portion of Synod income fluctuates quite a bit from year to year. In the prior year, 22-23, it was over 850,000. This past year, it was 562,000. It included in this past year 220,000 in funds received from the proceeds of a closed congregation, as well as support from the ELCA for our Director of Evangelical Mission position that we share with the ELCA, and then also the allocation of resources held by the Synod to help fund Synod activities. Next slide. This pie chart looks at our actual expenses in 23-24. The darker blue is mission support to the ELCA, and the green is grants to institutions and agencies. Those are shown in this pie chart as percentages of total expenditures for the year. But these two items are all funded by the $1.277 million in mission support received from congregations that we saw in the previous chart. So 51% of the $1.277 million is committed to ELCA mission support. That's the 641,000 in dark blue. 8.2% of the 1.277 million is awarded to a list of institutions and agencies that the Synod has been supporting for some time, and that's about $107,000 in the green. Those grant beneficiaries in the green include Agape San Diego, the San Diego State University Campus Ministry, Pacific Lutheran Theological Seminary, Lutheran Planned Giving Partnerships, CCLM, LRCC, Cal Lutheran, and others. And while some of these grants are quite small, several are significant in size, including one of roughly $26,000 and one of over $40,000. But it's important to note that these two pieces of the pie, the 51% that goes to the ELCA and the 8.2% in these grants, represent almost 60% of the mission support the Synod receives from congregation, which the Synod is then passing on to others. The big yellow slice of the pie is all of the congregationally designated gifts noted on the prior slide, but here they're all grouped together, totaling up to the number that I provided before, the $695,000 roughly. And these are all brought in from congregations and then sent out by the Synod to their designated locations. The light blue slice on the left represents 41% of expenses for the year to support Synod administration. These are the expenses we need to sustain Synod operations. And of that total of roughly 1.084 million, 83% is compensation and benefits. The rest includes other administrative costs, including insurance, equipment, leases, contract and professional services, utilities, etc. And then the thin purple slice is support for Synod ministries, an amount that we have been making a concerted effort to grow over the last couple of years. Next slide. This slide shows our financial position at the end of the 23-24 fiscal year, sometimes called the balance sheet. It shows that we have assets of $15.7 million and offsetting liabilities and equities. We have $12.26 million of financial assets that are invested in various vehicles that we will review shortly. We have $2.4 million in fixed assets related primarily to our Center for Learning in Santa Ana. On the liability side, both the designated funds of $10.65 million and our temporarily restricted funds of $1.08 million are reserves set aside for future use. We also have some permanently restricted funds from donors and $2.5 million in unencumbered equity. Next slide, Terry. Thank you. This slide shows how we're investing the $12.26 million in financial assets that we hold. So one thing you can see here is that we have several MIF term investments grouped together with maturity dates of 2024, 25, and 26. These are buckets of funds that we know we will need to access down the road. The maturity dates are spread out so that we can gain access to these funds as we need them. Towards the bottom, there is a MIF demand account with roughly $150,000 in it, earning 2.5% interest. This is where we house funds that we will need this year, but don't want to have just sitting in our checking account. So this money, coupled with the $314,000 in the checking account, is designed to see us through the end of the summer. In the near future, as the one-year bucket matures, we move it into a demand account so that we can access it during the year without penalty, and the two-year bucket will become the next one-year bucket. The three will become the two, and we'll create a new three-year bucket from other funds. And all of this is designed so that we can make sure that we're investing as best we can, everything except what we need immediately for Synod operations this year. You may also note that there's, towards the top of the page here, there's another MIF term investment, 6 years in length, that matures in January with a total of $1.8 million. These funds actually belong to Agape San Diego, the campus ministry at SDSU, but we're holding these funds for them in a vehicle of their choosing. And then we have several endowment funds managed by the ELCA, including Matthew 25 and Warner Trust. We have several Thrivent funds with varying dollar amounts and varying investment objectives from conservative to aggressive. And our long-term investment vehicle is the Nuveen Aggressive Fund, which is an actively managed fund holding right now $3.17 million of our financial assets. Roughly 80% of it is invested in equities. And in the first quarter of 2024, it earned in that quarter alone nearly 6%. Our finance committee meets at least every 2 months, and they actively review the investments and try to maximize the funds that are available for our various ministries while minimizing risk. Next slide, Harry, and we're going to skip over this one for a second and come back to it. So if we go to this one, which is 3-7 for a minute, I think it's important to keep in mind a couple of things as we look at the budget that the Assembly will be asked to approve next Saturday. The Synod's fiscal year runs from February of one year to January of the next year. So right now we're partway through the 24-25 budget year. So it's really too late now to set and approve the 24-25 budget, but the 25-26 budget year doesn't start for another 7 months and extends through a period that ends 19 months from now. So at last year's assembly, the assembly voting members were asked to approve the 24-25 budget that was being recommended by the Synod Council based on the information that was available at that time. But of course, when the budget year starts 7 months later, it's not surprising that sometimes assumptions and needs have changed and shifted. So just to kind of give you the layout of this part of the document, at this point in time in slides 3-7 that you're looking at through 14, we have before us in columns of numbers moving from the left to the right. We have the 22-23 audited budget numbers, then the 23-24 audited budget numbers, so 2 years of historical data, then the 24-25 budget that the Assembly approved last May. And then to the right of that, we have what we call the spend plan for 24-25. And this generally follows fairly closely the approved budget, but recognizing that this budget was approved 7 months before the start of the budget year and that assumptions and circumstances change, the spend plan tweaks the budget based on what we now know. So I sort of think of it as a spend plan for how to live this budget this year. And then finally, on the right-hand column of numbers, the blue column, we have the budget that we'll be asking the Assembly to approve for 25-26, built on what we've learned from the budget year that just ended and the budget year that we're now living. So now if we can go back to slide 3-6 for a
And
minute.
just a second, there was a question in the chat asking about the Ekstrom Avenue property. And so I put what that was in the chat, but I want to make sure that answers the question. I think we're planning or hoping to have I believe it's an African descent ministry out of that site. I don't know where that is, where that stands, but we have, when we sold the Atonement property, we leased back office space for that possible future ministry. And I think that lease ends in 2025.
Okay.
Does that answer everybody's questions?
Okay. So back to slide 3-6 for a minute. So what we have here on this slide is some of the basic assumptions that drive the spend plan for 24-25 and the budget proposal for 25-26. So for starter, our spend plans and budgets are largely driven by mission support that we receive from our congregations. And as I mentioned, that represents nearly 50% of the income that supports the budget. And because mission support that we received in 23-24 ended up being a little bit lower than anticipated, we adjusted the assumption about mission support in 24-25 downward to more closely match the actuals from the year that just ended. And then for 25-26, we're assuming that mission support will stay flat. And then we have assumptions related to anticipated non-congregational income, money we expect to receive from the ELCA to support the shared Director of Evangelical Mission position, and money we anticipate drawing from designated funds to support synodical operations. And then on the expense side, these assumptions look at the, of course, the 51% mission support that we're passing on to the ELCA, the 8.2% of mission support that we distribute to the list of institutions and agencies, And then the increase that we plan for salary and benefits, which we pegged at 5% for the current year spend plan and 3% for the 25-26 budget. So now if we go back again to 3-7, this page is really a summary of the budget information that's presented in greater line-by-line detail on pages 8 through 14, but you have it all here on one page summarized. So of course, on the income side, we have the mission support staying flat as you look across for the Synod plan and the budget for 25-26. Restricted designated contributions fluctuate from year to year. So sometimes they're a little hard to predict, but they're generally in the 400,000 range. And it doesn't really impact our budget because these are pass-through items. This is money that comes in from congregations to the Synod, and then we pass it on to the designated recipients of the donations. Non-congregational income fluctuates a lot more, largely dependent on whether we have closed congregations with proceeds generated by the closing. I think it's important to note that while some of those funds are used to support the day-to-day work of the Synod, a significant amount of these funds are not fed into the budget, but are designated to support growth in existing or new ministries within the Synod, which we'll talk about a little bit later. On the expense side, the benevolence expenses are very much driven by the mission support and designated contributions received from our congregations. Synod office expenses include everything related to the operation of the Synod, including comp and benefits for staff and all the other operational expenses listed. The growth in comp and benefits that began last year, if you look across, you can see that there was a big jump. Some of it, of course, is due to cost of living increases, but some of it is due to staffing adjustments made during the transition between bishops. There was a concerted effort made to keep staffing costs down, but it became clear that important objectives needed to be addressed, including candidacy coordination, anti-racism, Latina ministry, and communications. And so we had to not just increase compensation, but also add staff. And then we have the important work being done by various ministry teams, and we're trying as best we can to support those activities. Total expenses under the spend plan for 24-25 are about 2.34 million, and for the budget to be presented to the Assembly for approval for 25-26, about 2.38 million. One thing you'll notice on the net ordinary income line for 25-26, just below the total expense line, there's a negative number, 122,000 as a loss. We could close that gap by adding more non-congregational income to balance the budget. But we decided this year, as Terry and I talked, to not do that, in part because I think it's a useful reminder to us that balancing the budget requires filling gaps with funds we've received over the years from close congregations. And in part because we're looking at a budget that's going to operate 7 to 19 months out from now, and a lot can change over that time period. So it's easier to make adjustments up or down next year when we're developing the spend plan for 25-26 than it is to bake it into the budget right now. The other items at the very bottom of this page are adjustments related to depreciation that are outside of direct operations. So if we move now to slide 3.8, the slides 3.8 through 3.14 are kind of the line by line details of what was summarized on slide 3.7. We're not going to spend a lot of time on these details, but I do want to highlight a few things. First, on the bottom of page 8 and continuing on to page 9, we have a list of the institutions and agencies that are the beneficiaries of the 8.2% of undesignated mission support revenues received from congregations that the Synod passes on to these agencies. The total mission support grants line, which is about 2/3 of the way down on page 9, is over $100,000 each year, and it's calculated as 8.2% of the total mission support received in that particular year. So just as mission support fluctuates a little bit up and down from year to year, so does the dollar amount of the 8.2% designated for these grants. And most of these individual grants are based on a percentage of the total that makes up the 8.2%. So these also fluctuate up and down. Total benevolence expenses at the bottom of page 9 for 25-26 are budgeted at $1.197 million, which represents over 50% of Synod expenses for the year. Slide 310. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail here, but this is comp and benefits, continuing ed, professional expenses, travel. I also won't go into slide 311 very much. That's other operational expenses. On slide 312 to 313, I do want to talk about this a bit. At the bottom of 312, and continuing on to the next page, this is the category of synodical leadership, events, education, and ministry teams. And you can see some of the details of what's included here, including training grants, and support for ministry teams. You may notice that some things have been crossed off, and that's not because we don't care about them, but because there hasn't been a demand for funding for them recently, or there's funding for them elsewhere in designated funds that don't show up in the budget. But among the things we're trying to grow that are important to us are things like anti-racism, accessibility, tapestry, which is the LGBTQIA plus ministries, Amparo, immigration and border work. And I think it's worthy of noting that if you look at the total expenses in this section of the budget shown on page 3-13, it's grown from $16,570 in 22-23 to $38,350 in the proposed 25-26 budget. So I think that we're still trying to grow it even more, but there's been significant growth over the last 4 years. So this is the budget, the column in blue again that will be voted on next week. Slide 315.
Alan, hang on just a second. There's a question that Bishop's vehicle has been cut. That has not been cut. Julie, Pastor Julie, where are you seeing that?
I think maybe
Yeah, depreciation, we
right.
don't know until the audit is done. That is calculated as part of the audit. We don't put it in the budget. And they calculate it each year. So it'll show up as actual expense, but not as something we budget for. So
Right. So the blank lines on the last three columns are not, it doesn't mean it's been cut. It just means that we don't have the depreciation numbers yet. Okay, so 315, we're shifting gears a little bit here. This is the mission funding plan for the current year 24-25. And this involves activities and initiatives to support new ministries, including SOCs. It took me a little while to figure out what SOCs are: Synod authorized worshiping communities, New Starts, and other initiatives overseen by our Director of Evangelical Mission. In this 24-25 budget, we're looking at expenses of over $675,000. 56% of that amount comes from Synod mission funds outside of our general operating budget, and the rest from ELCA grants and additional support from local congregations. But I think it's important to note here that the Synod mission funds that we're talking about here come largely from the proceeds of closed congregations. So we do use some of those funds to help support the operating budget, but a lot of what we get from closed congregations, we're trying to turn back into growth and support of new ministries. Slide 316 through 318, this is a report, an end of the year report on mission support received last year by each conference within the Synod and by congregations within each conference. Slide 319 through 321 is a listing of all the grants and scholarships that awarded in 23-24 from Synod designated funds. I won't go through them all, but the different funds that we're looking at here are Latino Ministry Endowment, Warner Trust grants, Catherine Wright scholarships, GEM awards, Robert Miller scholarships, and Lori Line scholarships. And then the next slide, 322, is our recognition for congregations that provided the 2024 mission support intent information to Terry earlier this year. And then there's also additional recognition for those congregations that pledge to tithe 10% of their current income to mission support. So if you're looking at this and you don't see your congregation listed as having turned in the mission support intent form, you can contact Terry to get one of those forms. It's not too late to do that. And then finally, slide 23 through to the end is our audited financials for 23-24. I think, if I remember correctly, that last year we didn't get the audit documents in time to include in the notebook, but this year we did. So it's all there, and it was pretty normal findings. Auditors don't like to heap too much praise on organizations, so they said there are no material misstatements. So, any other questions? I think you're required to have at least 3 questions. Yeah.
Darren's got his hand up. Pastor Darren's got his hand up, Alan.
Okay. Yes,
Thanks for your
Pastor
work
Darren.
on this, Alan. So I'm hearing you describe a challenge for you, this narrowing margin between inflation, especially cost of living increases, and then declining mission support. Is there a percentage rate of decline that you're assuming in mission support this and next year?
No, actually, we're assuming that it's going to be flat. That if you look at 23-24 actuals, we did drop it ever so slightly, but a very, very small amount from 23-24 into the spend plan for this year and the budget for next year. But basically, it's flat. And we thought that that was appropriate because even though there is a decline, it's a really very slow decline. If you go back to that very first slide where it showed over 7 years the mission support from congregations, it's not steep. So we didn't want to be overly aggressive in our assumptions about declining mission support.
Well, thanks for clarifying that. If I could, the budgeted grant for campus ministry went from a fixed amount of 48,876. It's been that for, I don't know, 8 or 10 years, to 44 something. So about an 8% decrease in moving us from a flat amount to a percentage. So I'm just wondering if the benevolence as a percentage rate was decreased or new ones were added, or how we might anticipate that trend.
And Terry, it might be helpful to pull up that page, which I think is 3-9 or 3-10. But we didn't change the 8.2%, but as I mentioned, the amount of the actual dollar amount of this grant funding does, even though it's 8.2% of mission support, when mission support goes down, then the total available also goes down. So if we look here at mission support grants by institutions, agencies, in the fiscal year ending in January 23, it was $108.757 thousand. That was the 8.2% of mission support. And then the next year it dropped to 103. And then in the base budget that we approved last year, we had it at 109 because we didn't yet know that the prior year was going to come in short. And now for the spend plan for this year and the budget for next year, we've got it at 103,000. But the problem that your grant in particular presented to us, because there are only a handful of these grants that are fixed dollar amounts. Almost all of them are percent based, and the ones that are fixed dollar amounts are several of them are because the amount is so small. We're talking about $250 for the year, that it didn't make any sense to make that a percentage-based grant. So those, and then there are 2 others that are contractually fixed amounts that we couldn't change. But other than that, everything except the Agape grant were percent-based. And so if we left the Agape grant at a fixed amount of 48,876, if we kept doing that, it was going to put a significant squeeze on the other grants, especially Pacific Lutheran which, they're the other big one that was 28,000 at one point and then down to 25. And we're assuming going across this year next 26. But if we left the agape grant at a fixed dollar amount at the 48,000 all the way across, then the Pacific Lutheran Theological Seminary grant would take an even bigger hit because it is a percentage-based grant. So we really thought that to try to sort of spread the hit among all the recipients instead of just a few of them, that it was fairer to convert the agape grant to a percent-based grant. And I know in the early months of this year, because of the way the money flows in and out, the first couple of months were a bigger hit. But over the course of the whole year, it should spread out. But that was the reasoning that we had for shifting it to a percent base, because if we kept it at a fixed dollar amount over time as mission support declined, and as the dollar amount of the 8.2% declined, all of the other grant recipients were going to take a heavier hit each year.
Yeah, thanks for explaining that. So it was the decline in the total benevolence is the same percentage, and mission support stayed flat, but benevolence is less because, well,
the mission support grants are lower than they were in 22-23 because mission support was lower than it was in 22-23. And when we looked at 23-24, at what the actuals were for that year, we tried to take that and then draw that across to the current year and next year as on the assumption that it would be essentially flat.
Okay, thanks.
Yep. Other questions? Going once, going twice. All right, well, thank you very much. I appreciate the fact that you all took time out of your morning to listen to this stuff. I think it's a challenge to stay awake when you're hearing numbers just thrown at you for 20-30 minutes. So I appreciate it. Thanks.
And thank you, Ellen, and thank you, Terry, as well, for all the good work you have done. And also, I want to echo your thanks to Tom Pankow for his work previous. We've been in good hands, and we continue to be in good hands. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you all. And if you're coming to the next hearing, log out and log back in at 11:15 on the other link provided. So see you there.
Take care.